everyone. Sorry, I didn't mean to start you. I didn't realize how loud that was. Good afternoon, and I'm Shruti Mukund, the Director of Community Engagement. And I always say this is my special time because I get to sit on the set and pretend I'm a part of Kim's Convenience, but no. I work in the admin offices, but I curate all the things that happen around the play. This is the first of the events that we're doing. And July 12th, we have a Korean Convenience Festival, spelled with a K, to pay homage to all the Korean culture. We have the Korean Embassy, the Korean Culture Center is also working with us for that. And so that is on July 12th. We will have a Korean food truck, dance, K-pop dance party, and some vendors. So please stop by between 3 and 7 on July 12th. And then July 19th, we'll have Grace and Sojin back to talk about mapping Korean American businesses in the DMV. More into the, we'll go more in depth with the research that they have done. And we have the story time at the Olney Library that the Assistant Director of the play, Yuri Kim, will be doing the story time. And then we have a book club for Crying at H Mart. That's next Tuesday. So if you read the book, come for the discussion. But now, thank you for joining us for this special panel discussion exploring the impact of Korean American immigration on the cultural and economic landscape of the United States, with a focus on stories rooted in food, memory, and resilience. This conversation brings together a curator, Sojin, a chef, Tae Strain, and a scholar, Grace Kwan, whose work dwells deeply into how Korean American experiences shaped by migration, labor, entrepreneurship, and cultural expression have contributed to the rich fabric of the DC and Greater Washington region. Together, the panelists will reflect on the intergenerational journeys of immigrant families, the role of food in our community, identity and resistance, and how everyday spaces from markets to supper clubs become powerful sites of heritage and innovation. And all of you should have a program. If you don't, you can grab one at the entrance, which has all the bios of our wonderful panelists. Thank you for joining us, Grace, Sojin, and Tae. I'm going to get us started with a question that's sort of related to the play. So the play, Kim's Convenience, portrays a Korean-Canadian family navigating generational differences, cultural identity, and the immigrant experience through the lens of a family corner store, which we're sitting in right now. How do you see these themes reflected in real Korean American narratives, particularly in your own work or communities you've engaged with? Anyone?
I think this topic in particular is really important to me because my parents, when we immigrated to the United States, they were also ethnic entrepreneurs. They opened up dry cleaners in the Northern Virginia area. And so I grew up basically in, like when I haven't seen the play yet, which I'm gonna watch later today, but in the TV show, it's when the children are actually like working alongside their parents in the store. It's really reminiscent of how I grew up. I was, working the front desk while my parents were in the back, and this is like when I'm in second, third grade, right? Up throughout like high school, and I'm putting tags onto like the shirts and different clothing that come in, and I'm communicating in kind of a place of my parents whose English wasn't so great, and so kind of having grown up in that setting and having seen how hard my parents were really working, watching the show and now the play, it really hits home for me. And I think that's the experience that a lot of 1.5 generation Korean Americans in the DMV area actually went through as well.
1.5 means?
Oh, sorry, 1.5 generation is like kids who were born and raised a little bit in Korea and then came over at a very young age. So they still have a lot of connections to both Korea and to America. So you kind of grow up somewhere in between both countries.
Hi, give me a second. Yes, so I want to preface by saying growing up as an adoptee into a white household is my lens is so particular. So many of my lived experiences are dramatically different from my fellow panelists. And I think for me, this show, this opportunity, it's really special in a way, not as a chef, but sort of just like as a learning opportunity for me. Like when I think about the immigrant experience, as it relates to so many of my fellow chefs and sort of like as I see it now as I'm getting older, it's a journey of bravery and it's a journey of expression, sort of like what it is to hold on to your autonomy and maintain your integrity for your story and navigating that within this very large and complex context of the world around you. And when I watched this show, it's funny, like I was first introduced to the show to my two little nieces. And I had no context of it. I was like, what is this convenience? I have no idea what this is. This was years ago. And watching it, I was like, this is so warm and endearing. And it did such a good job crafting that and rooting it in warm notions, but really weaving in quite real themes, racial themes, what it is to have to assimilate, what it is to like run businesses viably within this context. And these are really complex things, like within the scope of race and beyond. So like I love what it does and I love all the questions that it brings up.
And I would say, to add on to what my two colleagues said, there are two things I love about it. One is, I like what you said about the warmness, just that you have this family who, there's all sorts of like drama within the family, as there are in all families, and misunderstandings and crises, but you get the sense that they really do care and support one another. And I love the way in which that is shown, where it's not like dysfunction, but it actually is ultimately love and support. And then the second thing I really love about it, which is beyond it being necessarily a Korean American, or a Korean Canadian business, I love that it's about these neighborhoods, which many of us know, which are these places that are these hubs. They're really diverse because they're neighborhoods that have transitioned, they have changed over time, and you're actually seeing it in real time. So you have older immigrants, you have older residents, you have newer immigrants, and it becomes this really interesting place of intersection where they're not just a service or a place of commerce, but they become this hub of activity and relationship and network building among people that are very different, but actually come to have some sense of relationship and endearment for one another through this recurring relationship.
Yeah. I didn't grow up here, but I came here when I was 21, but then my aunt had lived here already for like a long time. They came in the 70s, and their families, it's really interesting in the Indian American community. First, they were all around the Beltsville area, and it was very mixed, even though they were intrinsically very Indian families there. But by the 2000s, it's all shifted now. So it's all down to 70. They're enclaves of things, but they're not business owners. So it's a very different way of interacting with and within a community, right? So it's interesting to see all these waves of what each immigration wave brings to each neighborhood and community. So because right now in Montgomery County, the Silver Spring area, the largest immigrant group is the Ethiopian and Eritrean group. And that's Amharic is the most spoken language in our county, which is really interesting. And then Virginia, I think, has more of the Asian immigration. So it's very interesting to see what brings which community to which part, and how then eventually they get displaced. So we'll figure that out later. In your work, whether through scholarship, curation, or cooking, how have you seen Korean American immigrant stories reflected in the spaces we inhabit and the communities we build?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's tough. Speaking about it, like most recently, coming from DC, I think that it's a really interesting landscape now in terms of the restaurants and in terms of cooking, because there was such an influx of Korean restaurants specifically there and Asian American restaurants maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago, prior to like it being more gentrified than it is now. Like DC is such a hub, but it hasn't really always been a cooking hub in the same way that we think of it socially and politically. So to see the density now of Asian restaurants and Korean American restaurants in DC and Maryland also specifically, it's pretty amazing. And then within them, it's interesting to see the very clear lines between ones that were opened by immigrants and have made like very conscious efforts to stay within that lane, very specifically, very traditionally, and then kind of like a new wave of restaurants and chefs who maybe are younger and they have this, not an Americanized, but like a different sort of like Asian American element to what they want to say with the food, both in terms of the flavors and ingredients they use, but also in terms of like the aesthetics of their restaurant. Like the notes may be a bit brighter, the energy may be a bit different. And like to me, it's always interesting to see that because I feel like you really can see this kind of like small generational difference between them. And it's a really good sample scale that we are in here because there is such a huge amount of Korean Americans. Like you don't have to go any further than Route 40 to see like 6 H marts so densely clustered, and it's a really amazing sample scale to see, and it's really fascinating for me as a chef to sort of see the diversity in those restaurants.
Yeah, and as an outsider, I think I've seen how there was Pan-Asian in like the early 2000s, and even just within like 25 years, there's such specificity to the food that's being now sold, and it's exciting to see that we've evolved in that direction. I mean, there'll be the special mango place that you go to, or you go to the, it's very clear that way. So that's nice to see.
I think that just as you referred to, that there is like specialization now, and there is a broad spectrum to everything from Pan-Asian offerings and stories. So, but also things that are much more specific. I am someone who grew up in the 1970s to immigrant parents who came in the 1940s, and I grew up in the DC area. I grew up in DC, and I will say it is a world of difference to where you find specifically Korean American stories available or embedded, because I would say in the 1970s it was a challenge to basically explain that Koreans weren't Chinese or Japanese. And so the fact that people know that there is, that it is a distinct country and culture, and that people know mandu and that you can buy kimchi at Safeway is a much different landscape than I remember.
The reason why I decided to focus on Korean Americans within the DMV area is because if you look at the scholarship that's out there, there's basically nothing written about our area. And everyone always focuses on Korean American stories in like Hawaii or LA or New York, but DC is just such a different place, and the way that the Korean American community came together here is such a unique story that I feel like it's been neglected and forgotten about a lot. And Sojin and I worked on a project. We were together with a team that wrote the first AAPI historical context statement for the city of DC. And we focused on Korean American history. And just the amount of times that we told each other, like, why hasn't anyone done this? Like, why hasn't anyone gotten these stories? Because, even now we feel like we were too late, right? There was a lot of people that even while we were doing our research we started like during COVID, and people were actually passing away. Like a lot of the elderly were passing away as we were doing our research. And so it's that idea, like, I kind of feel like we don't want there to be this hole anymore. We want to be able to capture these stories and be able to talk to people while they're still here. And that, I kind of wish we had started this like 20, 30 years ago, but at least what we can do now to kind of preserve the history that we have is really important. And so I think that's kind of, I'm hoping that has, and it has kind of, right? Because Maryland is now doing their own Asian American context statement as well, but it's kind of inspiring other people to realize, if we don't start now, we're really gonna lose a lot of what we have, our history and stories that we have to tell.
That leads me to a question for you, Sojin. As a folklorist and curator, how do you see Korean American run stores as sites of storytelling or cultural memory?
Oh, well, as both a curator and a folklorist, I mean, storytelling and cultural memory, right, are at the heart of everything we do. So we can find it anywhere. And we know that it's everywhere. We know our lives are filled with stories. We know that that in all of our many different multifaceted communities, our lives are held together by the stories that we tell one another and that we've shared together. So absolutely places of business are places full of story. They're both places of stories of the people who work there, but they're catalysts for new stories that happen through all the different interactions that happen in those places. So, restaurants are really obvious places. We all go and we eat at restaurants, often with family, with friends, with community, to celebrate important events, to mark important occasions. So those then become touchstones to these stories of our relationships with other people. So absolutely, I see that. I mean, if I could digress slightly on this topic, I want to bring someone into the room who is no longer with us, who joined the Ancestors in March, who was an exemplary storyteller and who was a real advocate specifically for Korean American entrepreneurs, mom and pop store owners, and his name was K.W. Lee. He was a journalist. He was the first Korean immigrant daily writer for a mainstream newspaper in the continental U.S. So he wrote for mainstream newspapers in Tennessee, in West Virginia, and Appalachia in the 1950s and the 1960s, before moving to California, where he wrote for the Sacramento Union for the rest of his career. But on 2 occasions, he went to Los Angeles and edited Korean newspapers that were about Korean immigrants and Korean Americans in English, because he started to see as early as the 1970s that people did not know who Koreans were. And if they did not know who they were, there was a big open space for misunderstanding or putting your own story or an interpretation of who they were. And so he decided he wanted to help Koreans communicate with people who weren't Korean, but he also wanted to help Koreans communicate to one another, because he knew generationally parents and kids did not know each other. And really importantly, what he did later in the 80s and 90s is he went back to LA when there was a lot of mainstream newspaper coverage about Korean immigrant businesses having fraught relationships with their customers, oftentimes in low-income neighborhoods. Oftentimes it was very racially drawn, right? It was in Los Angeles. It was often referred to as a Korean black conflict. It's the only way you ever heard Korean immigrant store owners talked about was in terms of that narrative, which is why Kim's Convenience is fantastic, because it's a whole nother narrative that we can tell about Korean immigrant store owners. But that's what KW's mission was. It was like, how did he put his reporters out there, and he wanted them to write stories about all different aspects of their lives. He wanted to be able to chronicle in English where they came from, what their relationships with their customers, the different types of things that they were doing, how they lived in community. And so I feel like if he was asked the question that you just asked me, how are they sites of storytelling and cultural memory, he would say these stores, these businesses are multifaceted, and they are full of stories that are tragic and painful, but they are full of stories that are beautiful, that are about refuge, that are about resilience, and ultimately that are about community.
So,
one thing I'm curious about is that I think in the general consciousness, right, like there's the soft diplomacy of how governments of foreign countries try to insert into like social conversations. And I feel the biggest, people started to sit up and notice Korea when Gangnam Style came about. Like it was like, Korea, not India, but it was,
There's a parallel analogy in there somewhere. Yeah.
No, but it was really interesting that they were using something as like, when India or like these countries send out like this, their version of culture is usually high culture. It's like they're classical dancers, or, it has to be something that's so precious. But it was so interesting. I'm sure somebody's done data and study analysis of this, but Gangnam Style was like probably your lowest bar thing that became, everybody knew it. And everybody was like, wait, there's Korean music, there's Korean thing. And what did that do for all of you growing up here? Did that change like the thing? Because right now, like everything about India is cool. Like Prada had a whole fashion show with snakes and ladders and Louis Vuitton things. But now suddenly everyone's looking up and wondering, oh, what is it? And everyone in India is sitting up. They're like, wait, they took our culture. They're selling this pair of like shoes that people wear every day. It's like Havaianas that are now costing like $2,000, $3,000. So everyone's like, you're appropriating our culture, but then the others are like, wait, you sat around and did nothing with it. So I'm curious, what impact did it have on you growing up Korean in America when suddenly the social conversation was, do you know this coolest song, Gangnam Style?
This is specifically related to Gangnam Style.
Not any song. I mean, no, it doesn't have to be.
I meant that as a moment in time. But
Yeah,
I think
that's all.
this is like such a great conversation for so many reasons, because the way that was phrased, it sort of speaks to how the things we value in America as cool or as of value versus sort of like in the origin countries, how they're sort of like valued in the same way. And Gangnam Style, there's so much irony to it. It's like very silly, but also the reach was undeniable. And I think that that's the thing. Like, you think about what it is, like what low-hanging fruit is, and sort of like what entry points are for how we associate with culture. Like, that's a really good one. And simple food is kind of like the perfect one, simply because like, while being so subjective, like delicious is just delicious. If you eat something and it tastes good, it just tastes good. It doesn't really matter what the context of where this has come from. And a huge conversation that often happens in restaurants is a price aversion to what we think of as like very like floor type foods, like noodles, dumplings, like these things, and like versus like their counterparts in French or sort of like more luxury places like you're talking about, like their equivalent of like pasta, and sort of like a price disparity there. And it really speaks to how we value these things and how we think about them, despite a lot of times these dishes and ingredients, they take the same amount of skill and time to process. So it really is funny, kind of like the value that we put on things in this country in that regard, in music and art and food, because surely the authors of these things, they probably do not intend for that or ever expect it to be received in that way by outsiders. So I think it's fascinating. It's a never-ending conversation in restaurants. So
for me, I really see, like, one of the things that I see is we have what's called like lunchbox moments or lunchbox stories, and there are a lot of Asian American kids will talk about how they used to bring in lunch from home, and it's like your leftovers from dinner, right? And how many kids would like bully you, make fun of you. So like when I first immigrated to the US, I would bring, like, my mom didn't know anything about American food. We just brought Korean food for lunch, right? Kimbap and like different stuff. And kids would be like, what are you eating? What's that smell? Why is that black? And I was basically shamed into eating sandwiches, and I don't really like sandwiches, so it was terrible. I was like crying to my mom, and I remember my mom took me to the grocery store. She had called her friend because she didn't know how to make a sandwich. She called her friend, was like, what's a sandwich? How do I make it? We went to the store, and my mom literally just bought the cheapest ingredients that she could find and put together, like, it was like, I think it's like called Bunnings. I don't know if anyone remembers that. It's like a really cheap, you know what I'm talking about, salty, terrible lunch meat. I can't even call it meat. I don't know what it is. But like, I absolutely hated it. I wanted to eat the Korean food my mom would make, but I couldn't because everyone would bully me so much. And I think it's a completely different like time right now where my nephew, my sister's son, is literally bringing Korean food to school and like being very proud of it, and people are curious about it. And there's even, they read like a story in class about like a Korean kid bringing like lunch to school. And for me, it's like both of my sister and I just started crying when we heard about this, because it was such a different time, right? For what we went through, or the trauma that we went through versus like what my nephew is going through now. But I think it is also really important to remember that with this also comes a lot of, like you were talking about, questions of like, and I think you pointed to this too, is that Korean food in America is also very much lately being controlled by what the government wants to put out there, the Korean government, and the kind of the selling of culture, the importing of culture in order to, because Korea is, South Korea doesn't have a lot of natural resources. So it's a very innovative country because they have to think of ways of what to sell. And right now culture is one of those things, but there also comes some problems that come with that, right? Where people now, is culture something that's really important to some people becomes a fad to other people. So I think there's a there's a lot of talk about that in food studies about what that really means and what that's gonna look like in the future.
I have nothing more to add. I thought that was great. I'm way too old to talk about how Gangnam Style actually impacted my growing up because I was very grown by then.
Yeah, and I think the other biggest export is K-dramas, and I think the pandemic sort of was that accelerator for people to start obsessing over. I say obsessing truly because my sister is obsessed with K-dramas, and now she pretends she can speak Korean, but she actually did go to Korea, so and so it's really interesting how something seemingly so innocuous becomes that becomes taking the story forward, right? The cultural story forward. So, what have you experienced that you thought is like whatever, but actually turns out to be a really important thing that changes the way people perceive you in the world as a Korean American doing the work you're doing?
In terms of the wider knowledge and popularization of Korean culture for people?
No, it could be anything. Like it's like how the it's how you're perceived as you navigated your lives here and then your work here. I mean, you've been at the Smithsonian for the longest time. Like, maybe it was a misconception or it's a thing that you've navigated and then you've had. Either it helped you or it kind of deterred you, and then you had to work around it. I'm just curious.
I mean, I think that all of us would have like childhoods rife with people, because there are narratives that certain people control that go out there and they become very popular and they become very prevalent. And so it's always trying to face those narratives and say, yes, but it's not everything. So I think in the work that all of us do, what we're trying to do is create new narratives so there's a greater variety of narratives. I will say that a narrative that was really big when I was growing, I mean, there are two things where Korea went onto the map when I was growing up. Well, I'll say one, and that was Koreagate in the DC area, which was a big scandal that had to do with bribery and the dictatorship. And so I feel like when I was growing up, it was always sort of like, Koreans not trustworthy, that's corrupt. And that I feel like was when people sort of began to think about Korea. The other thing in terms of the Asian culture more generically, because a lot of times we're not Korean, we're just like generically Asian because people aren't quite and there are sometimes when that's a good thing. Like I feel very strongly that I'm Asian American and I'm sometimes Korean American, but I'm probably more often Asian American, right? So that's not a bad thing. But so when I was growing up was when in the 70s is when Bruce Lee is coming to huge worldwide popularity. And so that's both a great thing, but also a mortifying thing, right? Because everyone associates, Asians with being really good at martial arts. And I remember like being mortified at camp because this large group of kids, and I'm growing up in DC, so a large group of Black kids would chant, Bruce Lee, Bruce Lee, Bruce Lee, every time they saw me. But so that was like, that mortified me. Like I thought like, oh my God, this is terrible. And my male cousins like all love Bruce Lee. They all have his posters on their doors, and Bruce Lee is amazing. Like I love knowing about him and reading about his life story now. I find him to be a powerful icon of Asian American just personhood and artistry, really. But I now am doing a project that is actually about Asian martial arts in DC, and I've been interviewing martial arts of many different backgrounds and races and ethnicities and generations. And I am really loving it and sort of becoming comfortable in this space of people and their associations and their practice of martial arts and how they interpret it, because it's varied. It's very varied.
Yeah, and in the play too, he keeps talking about the martial arts that he can do. So
I can't think of a specific moment. I think realistically, for me, I spent the majority of my life running as far away from what it was to be Korean American as possible. And I kind of feel as I lifted that and became more comfortable wanting to embrace what it was to be Asian American. I started to see all around me that all the things that seemed so uncool when I was younger were suddenly very in vogue. I think the Bruce Lee one is hilariously accurate. Like I was obsessed with him. I'm a generation ahead. And, you know, for me, the representation was slim, much more than it was for you, but still like quite slim, and sort of like to think about how Asian men specifically were portrayed. I mean, it's very tragic. And so to see Bruce Lee, who embodied power in so many different respects, you were like, oh wow, this is an archetype that you can really be proud of. But that pride was still sort of like very internal. I certainly wasn't walking around telling my friends like, I think Bruce Lee the coolest thing ever. And now I look around, I can't really, again, I can't remember a specific moment in time, but all of these things that I thought were completely uncool, like Asian culture, Asian food, kimchi, all these things, they are suddenly totally cool and suddenly totally accepted, and the representation is massive at times. I'm shocked a lot of times, which is a very, very good thing. I guess for me, it was more just, I opened my eyes and it was all around me after living for so long and thinking that like, it didn't really exist.
But I think it's also a testament for the work you guys have been doing. It's people like you who've changed that narrative and who've gotten into spaces and, you know, just shown up. And I think that change happened like with many of you doing that. And that's why the next generation sees so much more of that, right? So it just didn't happen in vacuum. It happened because people like you stepped out of your comfort zones and put yourself out there. It is. Before we go to you, I just want to bring up something that you told me when we had our call about your story with David Chang. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but over 160,000 South Korean children have been adopted by American families since 1953, and it started primarily due to the Korean War and its aftermath. But there's also a lot of other everything's complex. Anyway, so it's governmental policies and social attitudes and things like that. So there is a lot, you know, obviously these adoptions have significantly shaped the Korean American community, and there's this issue of, you know, identity, belonging, and all of that. So you've been referring to some of it since we started talking here today, but can you tell us a little bit about how you started working with David Chang and how you explored your identity through that?
Yeah, for sure. To go far back, I did not want or intend to be a chef. I went to undergrad, I wanted to be a social worker. I was very adamant about that. Cooking was just not a thing that would seem like a viable career, which again, like speaks probably to like how I was, where and how I was brought up. I mean, like that's a very real cultural note of time and place. And I took this path in food, and with not really any sense of where that would go. You know, it was as much escapist as it was a conscious decision. And just saying, I'm going to just avoid going back to higher education or grad school, and I'm going to chase this path. And I spent the majority of my early career working in Western restaurants, you know, like what we would call as New American or just modern American, never really seeking out Korean or Asian general food at all. I think things started to evolve a bit for me when I moved to New York, simply because like you're surrounded. I was more tightly surrounded by just a lot more ethnic groups than I was growing up down the street in Parksville. And so the lid was pulled back a little bit then. But very much so when I moved to San Francisco. I worked at a restaurant called Progress, and San Francisco is, has a really, really profound Asian community, specifically Chinese community. And I think that was the first time for me, personally and professionally, I was like 30-ish, where I became comfortable with the notion of what it was to be Asian American. I think just as a notion, I was never really comfortable saying like, I'm Korean, you know, all everyone wanted to say was like, I'm American. You know, like, I know I wasn't born here, but like, this is how I associate. This is the majority of the people I've grown up around. And I think so much of it has to do with like the archetypes, like we were talking about before. You know, if you're growing up in a very specific setting and these archetypes around you, they don't seem that attractive to you and they don't seem sort of like that valuable to you, it's very, very easy to to just exist within that, like exist within that shadow. And when I was in San Francisco at this restaurant in particular, it wasn't uncommon to work with that many Asians, but I was seeing them in a different light because they were these very, very proud, confident, incredibly skilled, intelligent humans who proudly wore the notion of Asian American. And that was a very new thing for me. Like it forced me to think about it in a different way. And it really changed sort of like how I looked at myself, how I looked at kind of the kitchens around me. And I think legitimately it was probably the first time the notion of pride entered my mind in terms of like what it was to be within the Asian American community. I was like, okay, this is something very special and powerful for me. And since then, like I've made a very conscious effort to sort of like continue to explore that. And that is the main reason I went to go work at Momofuku, which it's founded by a very famous Korean American named David Chang. He's like a pretty polarizing guy, but his influence in restaurants and food has been profound. But I can say with certainty that earlier in my life, I would not have ever chosen to go work for a Korean, simply because I wouldn't have wanted that association. I wouldn't have been comfortable with it. And just as I've gotten older and sort of like become more at peace with that, has this become really, really important. And it's allowed me to sort of, again, like my lens has completely changed. The things that, again, it wasn't even just that they weren't cool, it's that I had zero interest in acknowledging them. The food, the style, the music, like anything, I just wanted nothing to do with. And now the beauty there, not just within Korean culture, but sort of like the Asian culture in general, like regionally, my world has changed fundamentally. Like it's sort of this thing where it's like my paradigm was something before and my paradigm is something different now, with sort of like that base point of how I see the world and how I see food in kitchens. God, that was a long-winded answer. I hope that answered your question. I don't remember what your question was.
No, that was great. Thank you. Grace, did you want to add something about?
I guess just kind of going off of what Tay has said, I think it kind of shows like all three of us have very different experiences growing up. And I think there is a very particular type of Korean American that everyone kind of associates with the story of being Korean American. And I used to also feel kind of that I was that kind of typical Korean American, but I spent half of my adult life, I moved to Korea for over a decade, and then I came back more recently, like probably 6-7 years ago. And the way that I saw myself was completely different. Like I no longer fit into that like typical Korean American bubble like that I thought I was before. And I think that was a really good thing because like you said, it really changed the way that I saw what it meant to be Korean American. It forced me, because I no longer fit into this little niche of like amongst my friends. I was very different. The way I looked at the world was very different. And then I realized everybody else is so different too. And that it wasn't just me. And then during our research, during that, and then I did another research about ginseng, and just meeting so many different people and so many different stories made me realize that just being Korean American is such a spectrum. And I think that's like the one thing I hope that people are like really starting to kind of open up and realize, is that there isn't just one story, that we have so many different stories that are like over so many different generations and so many different experiences. And it really just shows this like kind of beautiful, I don't know, array of just like what it really means to be Korean American.
Yeah, and I think that's true of any immigrant community. And even we did this play called Sleepover, and so for that conversation we had is like being Black in Britain versus being Black in the US and what it means, and being an immigrant. And so it's and that's why everything is complex, let's just say that.
Can I just add to that, and also what Tay and Grace were saying, because I think that idea of region is really important. And what Grace was saying is DC is a very specific kind of place. It's very different from New York, Los Angeles, Hawaii. And as soon as I graduated from college, I moved to California. I moved to San Francisco and eventually to LA, where I lived a great portion of my adult life. And I went actually explicitly because I wanted to go to a region where no one would look at me and assume that I was not from here. And California, it is so dramatically different, as you said, that there are, my friends were like second, third, fourth generation Chinese, Japanese Americans, third generation Koreans, and they owned that and they wore it in such a different way than people on the East Coast experience it.
It is sort of freeing to be in that kind of a thing because you're not always wondering what you're giving out. You could just be sometimes, and I think that's a very interesting notion. A lot of people who did not grow up in the country where predominantly people look like you, and when you go there and you're just like, oh, everyone looks like me now. So it's sort of liberating in some ways, and then it teaches you a lot about yourself too. But actually, coming back to ginseng, in the play, they talk a lot about how it's not called ginseng in Korea. Yeah. So there's a whole bit about it, and it goes into the Korean-Japanese history, which if you haven't watched the show, I won't tell you more about that, but I just remember that. And then, so Grace, your research focuses on entrepreneurship and food waste as well as narratives. So how has this been used as tools of activism within the Korean American community?
And this is going off of what Sojin was saying earlier about different narratives. So the narratives around Asian American foods in this country is originally very much influenced by these original narratives before even the first immigrants came over. There were tourists, there were military, there were missionaries that were in Asia. And what they did was when they came over, they wanted to write these kind of sensationalized pieces of Asia so they could sell their books. And so the narratives around food started there. Like these terrible stories about Chinese people like going out into like the countryside and capturing whatever animal they could find, and these like grotesque stories about food. And the same thing happened in Thailand, same thing happened with Korea, same thing happened in Japan. And so there's these like continuous narratives that have come into the United States even before the first immigrants came over. And they set up this stage for what food has kind of looked like, and also the bodies that create this food. And there's this been narrative around Asian people as diseased and dirty, and those narratives still exist today, right? If you look at like, if you do some research, and I do a lot of like Google research into like what people are writing on like Google or Reddit or Yelp reviews, right? And it's always consecutively lower ratings for Asian restaurants, right? And it's always about the cleanliness, like all the comments about, oh, the bathroom was clean, or they're clean, or, you know, it's always around these narratives around clean or dirty places. But then you also have it when like COVID came around, right? There are these spikes in Asian hate. And all of that stems from these kind of original narratives. Plus, those also narratives influence policy. And a lot of like, the Asian Americans were the original illegal immigrants, right? It started with Chinese exclusion. And so I think what I really want to do like within my research is to kind of claim these narratives and to do reparative work through narratives that we tell ourselves through the production of our food. So I look at cottage food businesses where there are women who create food within their home, and how the kitchen is also a space of reparative work for women, but also taking those narratives and showing how they produce food as they tell their stories really is a new way of looking at how food is produced, and being able to kind of reposition these stories away from these old narratives that have happened into like these kind of new stories that don't think about cleanliness or dirtiness, but really look at how food is produced within the community. And so I think there's a lot of work being done in different areas where we are now, like Sojin was saying before, where new narratives are being told continuously. And I have an MFA in fiction and a master's in literature, so stories have always been like a way for me to see the world. And I feel like they're really a way that we can change the things that are happening right now in ways that seem so small, because stories seem very small, right? Individual stories seem very small. But honestly, as these stories are being told, they are going to take over kind of the old narratives that have been told before.
The stories might seem small, but actually it was the stories that first set up preconceived notion, I mean, that frame these things, right? Like, and that's sort of what even National Geographic went back and kind of started thinking of the lens of how they were portraying Africa or India and the stories that they had about them, and how it was always the starving, malnutrition children that were made very poetic shots, and they were like, okay, how do we reframe this story? And but that's what's going to then change into the future. And if you're interested and you do podcasts, I recommend listening to this Radio Lab one about MSG.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I haven't listened to it, but that's such a good example.
Yes.
Of something that was sort of redeemed and changed.
Yes, so the whole MSG, that MSG being terrible and it's horrible for you was a completely fabricated story as a part of the anti-Chinese hate. But then the Radio Lab story takes it all the way down to one person who claims it was him who did it as a bet. So I don't know. Anyway, it is worth listening to and doing a little reading if you don't do podcasts about MSG and its origin. But that's one of the things that how it just totally got fabricated into being something so dangerous for you. And MSG just makes food taste good.
So I'm definitely interested in hearing that, and I'd love to hear your take on that, because when we grew up, I mean, my sister and I used to joke about it because it was a spice, Ajinomoto, it was like a spice in our cabinet. And when we began to hear that, it was like, oh, uh-oh, why?
Yeah, I guess two things. First, small stories are so powerful, and I think that bad or good, they're far more powerful now because of social media and because of like fast dissemination of information. So like literally anything can become true in this day and age immediately. Like overnight, something is true from one human. So like it's very. I think about this often. I'm such a doomsday prepper. I'm often just terrified. But it's so true. Like the roots are so simple for things like that, and they can spread like wildfire. In particular, about things that can justify hate or judgment against an item, a people, anything that can justify somebody who might already have like a small inkling of feeling a certain way about a group or a thing. Like they're like, great, and this feeds the fire so quickly. The MSG thing is so perfect. And beyond the fact of whether or not you think MSG hurts your stomach or you think it's bad for you, I think the easiest way to look at it is just our bodies are wired in different ways. Different things affect us. Caffeine makes me feel crazy. It's awful for me. MSG does not. And so like this idea that MSG was like fundamentally bad, and then it developed such strong and definitive ties to Chinese food being horrendous for you is just like totally absurd. It's like unfathomable to me now, because it really is an entry ingredient. It's rooted in glutamate. It's rooted in something that was derived from nature. It's not developed in a lab. But it's hard because it's been so weaponized against the Chinese community. And, like the uptick in judgment against Asian Americans, I think specifically against Chinese, like following COVID, like any of these small things, they're just these huge ripple effects in how people are perceiving how they cook there, the hygiene in China or in Asia. And I also think that that's ridiculous too, because go to the New York Metro, then go to some of the metros in Asia, and you're like, you can eat off the ground, so lots of feelings.
Yes, Zoran Mamdani is promising to clean that up, right? I was mentioning the mayoral candidate who won the Democratic primary in New York. So, do you guys have any questions? Yes.
Since it's about entrepreneurship, I know I didn't grow up in the DC area, but my wife did. And one of the key Korean American things that she interacted with was the Junri. Can you talk a little bit about that? Just because that had a huge impact. People who didn't know anything about Bruce Lee or watched the Bruce Lee movie or something like that. That was a part of people's childhood.
She must have grown up in the 70s or 80s in Washington, D.C.
How many people remember the Junri commercial? Yeah, it was like an earworm once you heard it. So Junri is really, it's a great example of martial artists an Asian American martial artist. It is a great example of immigrant entrepreneurship that where they leveraged a really important moment and then were able to build something. Junri was an immigrant who came to study first in Texas and then came to Washington, D.C. in the 1960s and opened his first studio there and began opening up martial arts to lots of different people. You had a lot of things happening in the 60s. You had American servicemen who had been in various wars or stationed in Asia who had been exposed to martial arts, and people came back with that knowledge and interest. You had civil rights activism and ethnic consciousness in the 1960s. So lots of people were thinking about different ways of expressing themselves, different ways of defending themselves without arms. And Asian martial arts, both Taekwondo and Kung Fu and Japanese forms, became a means that people became very interested in. And then you had the change in immigration laws, right? So you had actually in 1965, the way in which the laws changed, where it favored people in certain fields or certain knowledge, and then also family reunification. You had an increase in people coming, right? And so all of that kind of combined, and then Bruce Lee becomes famous, combines, and this becomes a really viable niche for certain people. If they have this knowledge, if they trained maybe in Asia in the military and they learned some of these forms, it became something that they could leverage as a business. So he's one of several. I mean, he became what is known as the father of American Taekwondo. But there are a number of different really, really interesting immigrant Asian men who came in the 1960s in Washington, D.C., who opened studios, but also Taekwondos, also Korean forms, and also Chinese forms. And I mean, my introduction to some of, I grew up hearing that over and over again in my childhood, but I really learned about the other martial arts teachers and their importance through African-American practitioners who studied with them in the 1960s. And it's been a really, really interesting introduction to the ways in which people were interacting and forming community at that time around martial arts.
I thought I saw another hand raised. Yes.
So my question is for Chef Tay. Are you familiar with the comedian Uncle Roger? And I'm curious if you are, your thoughts on how he portrays.
I am actually not, if you could give a little context.
So, the question he asked was about Uncle Rogers. I don't know if anyone is familiar with him. He's a British Malay, Malay Chinese food critic. He again became very popular in the pandemic, and he goes, "Hiya," and he goes.
So he's a comedian, and he does a bit effectively where he reviews cooking of very engaging dishes from professional chefs and criticizes their not traditional takes.
Yeah, Jamie Oliver gets the worst of it, but he actually had a thing with Gordon Ramsay, and it was a fun episode. And actually, Gordon Ramsay gifted him like dishes after that. So you can check it out.
Yeah, authenticity in food is actually quite terrifying to me. Yeah, on a baseline is a funny thing for sure. But then also just thinking about, I haven't devoted too much of my life to cooking Korean food in earnest. You know, like there's a lot of Asian American, like kind of in general moments to the food. So I think about appropriation and authenticity in cooking a lot, just because like as a conversation, it's so prevalent now. And it's really, really polarizing on people's comfort level with how you incorporate ingredients, like staple pantry ingredients from a region, and sort of like what you're trying to say with them. You know, like I think about it all the time for me, like when I go to open a restaurant, you're like, how is this food going to be interpreted? Will someone see it through the lens of someone who's adopted and sort of like, this is his lived experience of like eating Asian American food and like growing up in this way with like American like family. So I think it's complex. I want to really believe that the open-mindedness and like the notions they're broader now, so there's more room for it if done the right way. But to what you're saying about him, I find that hilarious. And if I watched it, I'm sure I would think it was amazing, but also would be terrified if someone was coming to critique me and trying to make anything remotely authentic from Korea or any other region.
He just has a thing for Jamie Oliver, let's say that. He's nicer to other people.
I think it's hysterical, but I will say Jamie Oliver makes some really questionable choices when he's cooking the food.
Butter chicken's the worst, and his fried rice.
He put like sweet chili jam in the fried rice, and I was like, oh no. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I just feel like that's not gonna work flavor-wise, but
Grace is an excellent cook.
I just cook for fun.
Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question for the this one. So I am very much interested as a Korean history, which developed in the neighborhood in the area. And I've been here for 30 years, and she's the second generation. So that is why I wanted to know the beginning of the Korean heritage in this area. So I was just so excited to hear about your research. So if I wanted to do research, where do I go?
Oh, okay. So the historical context statement is published online through DC Gov now. So Sojin and I worked on that. And that traces kind of because we were supposed to be looking at DC proper, so that traces kind of the history, but it does bring in Maryland and Virginia in ways because you can't really separate those. If you go to dc.gov, and then there's like a search bar at the top of the thing, and then you put in Korean context statement, like what do we put in, like Korean context statement or Korean history or something, it should pop up, and then it's a downloadable like PDF, and you can read it. I will say, okay, I don't know if we're allowed to say this, but we did a lot of research. We did 3+ years of research, and it was a lot of work, and we couldn't put in like, everything that we had found. Also, later on, they made some editorial decisions that we were not comfortable with. So there's that. But, it does give a pretty good comprehensive history of Koreans in DC.
And just come back on July 19th. So she
we'll talk about
Yeah,
it.
they'll talk about it and present the whole thing in depth that day. Okay.
Yeah, already.
But I'll also say the Korean American Association of Greater Washington, they have a website, and I think they have made available, and they did some really extensive work. First in 1992, they published a history of Koreans in Washington, D.C., and then they did an updated version in like 2002. And I think they have PDFs of their entire volume online.
Yeah, they might. They have a Korean one and an English translated version too.
And it's
so
quite
that's
good.
Yeah, that's where we started with our research because there was nobody else really who had put together this.
And I have a lot of questions for Mr.
Okay.
Tay,
Right.
Mr. String.
Yes.
Yes. So where do I go to taste your food? I really want.
That's very kind of you. I just partnered on a new project in Clarksburg, Maryland, called Burnt Hill Farm. So that'll open in September, and that's it's basically a 117-acre polyculture farm. It's owned by just a local family that is really committed to regenerative farming and sort of sustainability of ingredients. So that will be a winery, that will be a casual restaurant, and that will be a chef's tasting menu to do food that I hope embodies the things we're talking about today. That'll open in September, and it'll kind of like roll out over the course of 6 months till all the things are open. Clarksburg, not Clarksville. Yeah.
Can you say the name?
Burnt Hill Farm. Burnt, yes. Farm.
Can we also plug Sojin's exhibit?
Yes. Right, I was actually going to end the whole thing with asking each of you to share something that you want to share with folks, so please.
I worked on an exhibition with the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, which is an exhibit that will be up at the Smithsonian American Art Museum until the end of November. So if you're down in Chinatown, and it's a very small, modest exhibition, but it is in some ways based on the work that Grace and I did, and it looks at and other colleagues of ours, and it's called Sightlines, Chinatown and Beyond. And because the American Art Museum is located in Chinatown, it's an exhibition that tries to orient the visitor to where they are, and then through 3 different clusters of stories, looks at the ways in which Asian Americans have an imprint upon DC. And on July 12th, we're actually going to have a martial arts program, which isn't actual martial arts competition. It's going to be sort of a competition of storytelling among 8 different martial artists representing different schools who are going to answer some outrageous questions about DC martial arts. So that's July 12th at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Oh, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, this is not Asian American related, but the Smithsonian Folklife Festival opens on July 2nd. It'll be up till July 7th. Please come out.
I should look it up online, but what are they focusing this year on?
Oh yeah, no, thank you for asking. So the theme is a beautiful theme. It's youth and the future of culture. And so we have communities from across the U.S. who are really, it's really youth-led efforts looking at the way in which young people are taking culture and reinterpreting and readapting it and keeping it vital by really changing it and making it their own. So we have a lot of different communities from around the U.S. represented there, doing everything from reclaiming language, native languages, to the building arts, young apprentices in the building arts, to Stax Music Academy. It's a beautiful program. Come out.
Yeah, that sounds really cool and I think very timely. Did you have anything to share for people to look out for?
No, if anyone knows of anyone who is Asian American who does cottage food businesses from their home, I would love to talk to them. You can find me on Instagram. It's Gracie, Gracie, and then EAT World, WRLD. You can also see all the food that I make. I post it up on there. But yeah, or if you know someone, just come up afterwards and let me know because I would love to speak with them.
So before we all go and get ready to watch the show, what is one thing in the DMV that if they want to experience a true Korean, food or store or something that they should go and try out? You can go second.
I don't know, I want to gatekeep, but so I live in like Clifton Centerville, so I'm where all the Koreans are. This is like the second Koreatown. And my favorite place it's called Bunga, and it's not only because my husband he has a company that does distribution of Korean goods and to like all the Korean restaurants in the area. And it's not only because like she always gives us really good free food, but it's just it tastes like my mom doesn't live here, my parents live in Korea, so I really miss my parents cooking. And it's like feeling like I can eat home food when I miss my mom.
Can you spell that?
Bonga, I think is how they spell it in English. Bonga. It's in Centerville. It's where the Dunkin' Donuts and the Virginia Tire is. But don't tell anybody else. I'm trying to gatekeep it.
If you have not, so there is an interesting historic building in Washington, D.C., which is called the Old Korean Legation Building. It's over on Logan Circle. It was a building that was used as the site of U.S.-Korea diplomatic relations. It was the first diplomatic office in the U.S. Representing Korea. This is from the 1880s. And then after Japan annexed Korea, the building was lost and sold, but the Korean government repurchased it. The Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Administration purchased the building sometime in the 2010s, yeah. And they've converted it into a museum that looks at the history of Korean U.S. diplomacy, but also looks at some of the really interesting students and exiles who are from Korea who came to the U.S. And it's free, you just make an appointment, you put on little things over your shoes and you get to walk through this old historic house in Logan Circle. It's very interesting.
And just to add to that, they remodeled, so they found old photos through magazines, and they asked Korean, because it was a family home for a very long time, so there was nothing really left inside, but they asked Korean heritage what do they call it, folk artists to recreate a lot of the items that were inside of the house. So it actually looks like a lot like the photos that were there, and with items made the way that they were back then. So I think it's an amazing experience.
I'm going to retreat a little bit, and I'm going to sandwich an answer to this with your request as well. So there's a first-generation immigrant who does cottage baking. Her name is Capital Jill in DC. It's only via her Instagram platform, but to me, she's like one of the most talented bakers, I think, in this area. No formal restaurant training, and just a great story, and just a super kind person, like within the industry, just something you want to support. Very difficult to acquire, very special to enjoy. Capital Jill Baking, yeah.
Jill, like J-I-L.
On that note, thank you, Tay, Sojin, and Grace for sharing your insights, your stories, and of course, tips now. But like you have all reinforced, storytelling is the true thing of keeping a memories, taking, changing direction of like societies and culture and things. So it's really important that you three came here to share your stories with us and kind of make this a richer experience for us as we're watching Korean Canadians in the Kim's Convenience. Again, thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. Yeah, just plan to spend your next 3 Saturdays here at Allman Theatre.